Live from Washington, D.C., this is Transport Topics Newsmakers, the digital interview series that gives you access to candid conversations between industry experts and a veteran reporter. Sponsored by Spirion, a Solera solution. Here's your host, Dan Ronan.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of Newsmakers from Transport Topics. I'm Dan Ronan. Our guest is someone who's very well known in the industry when it comes to economic matters. He's Bob Costello, the Chief Economist with the American Trucking Associations. Before we begin our conversation with Bob, I want to tell you that Spirion is the sponsor for today's edition of Newsmakers. So we're going to watch this short message and then we'll be back on the other side with Bob Costello after this.
Trailers and drivers are in short supply, so trailer managers need to do more with less. Optimize the way you manage your fleet operations. Get real-time visibility into every trailer's location and load status with Spirion's IntelliScan cargo sensing technology. Verify load status before dispatching the drivers. Prove detention with time-stamped images. Settle damage claims with visual evidence. Optical imaging and machine learning instantly detect which trailers are loaded or unloaded with an industry-leading 99% accuracy. Saving hours of wasted driver time, improving utilization, and increasing trailer turns. Always know what's going on inside every trailer so you can unleash your fleet's full potential. With IntelliScan from Spirion.
Now a bit about our guest. Bob has been with the American Trucking Associations for 25 years as the Federation's chief economist. He manages all of the ATA's collection, analysis, and dissemination of the trucking industry's economic information. This includes several monthly trucking economic indicators, the motor carrier financial and the operating data, and the annual forecasting. He also does a great deal of information and study on driver wage issues, fuel prices, as well as the yearly trucking almanac. Bob, it's good to talk with you and glad to have you with us on this edition of Newsmakers. Where would you describe the overall state of the economy at right now with regards to the U.S. economy? Then we'll sort of drill down a little bit deeper.
Well, thanks for having me, Dan. It's always a pleasure to do these types of things with you. So some really interesting, it's a unique time right now for the macroeconomy, right? I still think that the most likely path for the macroeconomy is a mild recession in the first half of this year. I will be honest though, Dan, the timing's a little tricky. Could be late first quarter, could be second quarter. In full disclosure, there are some economists that are calling it for it to be a second half of 2023 event. And to add sort of to the complexities here, what's called a soft landing is not completely out of the question. I don't think it's the most likely path. I think a mild recession is, but it's certainly in the cards. But even, thinking about the timing, first quarter, second quarter, it should be relatively short. It should be a relatively shallow for the broader economy, though.
But there's always the possibility of some sort of black swan event, such as if we end up with no resolution on the debt ceiling issue and we end up with some sort of a financial meltdown as a result of that. There are other things that could mess this up, right?
Oh, of course, you always have that. I mean, heck, we never saw a pandemic coming, right?
No, three years ago.
Yeah. So I do think, there's too much at stake not to get the debt ceiling, increased. Now, is there going to be a lot of fighting and bickering before then? Yes, but I think that at the end of the day, it'll happen.
The tonnage numbers are out recently, and they indicate that 2022 was a pretty good year. We're looking at almost a 4% year-over-year increase. Now, there was some pretty significant slowing in Q4, but overall, if you look at the 12 months, it was pretty good.
Yeah, so think about, I just told you the macro economy is slowing. We're not in a recession probably yet, but most likely path. But here's the thing, the freight market is worse than the macroeconomy for a host of reasons. Consumers are moving back to buying more services. Any of you that have been on a plane recently, I travel every week, they're packed, right? People are moving around. That means you're spending more on services. Going back, Dan, we love sports, right? People are going back to sporting events. They're going to the movies. Housing's in a recession, right? Both in terms of constructions and existing home sales. Factory output is slowing. You add it all up, the freight economy is worse. Now, some sectors are worse than others. And in fact, I could point to some that are not too bad. Yes, so it's a long-winded way of saying we're going back to historical trend, historical averages from a boom in the goods economy in the second half of 2020 through really early 2022. And it did decelerate, freight did decelerate in the second half of the year, in particular in the fourth quarter. There was no real peak season that we're traditionally used to seeing, and things have slowed down for freight.
Are we looking, Bob, at an economy that is 2019, but only in a better position than it was in 2019, maybe with more growth in terms of that balance that you speak of with goods and services? Yeah,
I mean, I guess there's one way of thinking. In 2019, the industrial side of the economy was awful, right? It was really bad. I don't see that happening. I do see factory output falling maybe 1% this year at most, versus 6.5% in 2019. So it won't be that bad. Excuse me, but. I think essentially what we're going to do here, and I'm really talking about contract freight, right? The spot market has slowed significantly more. And I think even the spot market's likely to level off here in late first quarter, maybe second quarter, and then sort of plateau before starting to come up. I'm talking to a lot of fleets that are feeling decent about the second half of the year. And knowing that the freight economy is leading the macroeconomy, I think that's realistic to think that maybe things can tick up a little bit in the second half of 23.
You talk about this idea of a recession, Bob, in maybe the first half of the year, and you keep saying a mild recession. What is the difference between a mild recession and one that's a blowout from an economic standpoint?
Yeah, so when I talk about that, I'm talking about, listen, I think for the year, GDP still goes up 0.5%, right? Wow. But in the first half of the year, you're probably going to see contraction of maybe, right now, the way things stand, I've got about 1.5% drop in the first quarter on an annualized basis, about half of that in the second quarter. And then we start to go back, closer to trend growth in the second, or about 1%, 1.5% growth, I should say, in the second half. And yet you add it all up, and that's 0.5% growth for the year versus 2020 when GDP fell 2.8%. If we go back to 2009, GDP fell 2.6%. So that's what a mild recession is. Even ekes out a little bit of growth this year on an annualized basis.
So if we were to look at this like in terms of a medical diagnosis, it's a temperature of 99.5 as compared to 102.3.
Sure, I think that's realistic. What's interesting, Dan? In the first and second quarters of 22, GDP fell by roughly the same amount that I expected to fall in the first and second quarters of this year. Now, the difference is they haven't classified that as a recession, primarily because the jobs market was so strong. The jobs market is still, the labor market's tight, and we know that well in the trucking industry, but it's not as strong as it was in the first and second quarters of last year. So I think that's why this will be classified as a recession. But again, the timing is tricky, and a soft landing, while I don't expect it, is not completely out of the question.
Yeah, we've heard that term soft landing used so many times, and maybe it happens. Maybe it gets a little bumpy though on the way down.
Maybe.
We just don't know. You mentioned labor, and I want to talk about that because you have spent a lot of time looking at labor markets. So let's again start with a large sort of a macro type discussion here, and then we'll narrow it down. The unemployment rate is very, very low. It's in the mid threes. It's at the lowest level since the 1960s, back when we had full employment in 1966, 1967. The economy in that respect, there's a lot of jobs. There's a lot of jobs that are unfilled.
Yeah, I mean, listen, prior to the pandemic, we were at that 50-year low of 3.5%, and we're right back there now. And the Fed would much rather, instead of 3.5%, they'd rather see 4.5% to 5% unemployment, because that would then be a headwind for wage growth, and then that would help with inflation. But right now, you know, even though the rate of growth in the job market is slowing, it's still growing. You know, after losing 22 million jobs in early 2020, we've regained all of those and more. And that leads to not only a low unemployment rate, but it leads to about 1.7, 1.8 job openings for every unemployed person out there. And so on a macro sense, before we get to trucking, the job market remains tight, and I think we'll stay that way for a little while. It's just be slightly less tight in the first half of this year and so forth than it has been.
Boy, if you are in the hotel or the hospitality or the restaurant industry, you really do have your pick of jobs to choose from, don't you?
Yeah, you know, as you know, Dan, you've been doing this a long time as well. You know that the labor market, especially for drivers, has been tough for many, many years. But now there are many sectors in the economy that are experiencing, you know, what we've been experiencing as an industry for a long time.
Yeah, they are. And what is the ratio, Bob, in terms of if you have one job opening, what is it? It's something like there's 3 or 4 people. There's some ratio that you economists use in terms of that, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I just like to look at number of job openings out there per unemployed person, and it's 1.7, 1.8 right now. And now somebody might say, well, why aren't those people taking those jobs? Well, I think a few things. One is there are skills gaps, right? That don't always match up precisely with the people that are unemployed. There's also geography. And there are parts of the economy that are laying off a fair amount of people. We know tech is, right? But I think, you know, one of the interesting things is construction labor has held up, even though home construction has fallen off significantly. And you might say, well, why is that happening? Well, traditionally there's a lag there, but I also think there's a lot of businesses that are like, let me see if this turns around before I start laying off people, because it's hard to hire them back. And so I think that you have sort of this lag effect. We normally do, but it might be even more pronounced this cycle than previous cycles. And businesses being scared of having to try to then rehire, that's a very nervous thing for them. And so they may hold on to people longer.
Bob, you came out with your report late last year about the driver shortage in the country. And you pointed out that it had improved a little bit. 4,000 or 5,000 drivers dropped from the low 8,000s to the high 7,000s. Why did that happen?
Yeah, so we went from a high of about 81,000 short in the truck driver occupation in 2021 to about 78,000 in 2022. And that was simply because freight had slowed a little bit in late last year. But I will say, I'm expecting it to dip further. It's still a shortage in 2023, but more like 65, maybe 70,000 versus 78,000 last year. And the reason for that, again, is sort of this softness in the first half of the year before things start to improve. It's still a shortage, but it's not quite as bad. Now, one other thing on this, Dan, you know, people that aren't familiar with this, you know, I can see why you draw this conclusion, but I often hear from people, well, why does the U.S. trucking industry have a shortage of drivers? It must be, you know, you're treating them bad and pay is bad and so forth. But let me be very clear. This is not unique to the United States of America, right? There's a shortage of drivers in Canada. There's a shortage of drivers in Mexico, but there's also a shortage of drivers in Europe, right? Romania has, just as an example, Romania has
a small country.
Yeah, they have 71,000 unfilled truck driver jobs right now. Germany has somewhere between 60 and 80,000 unfilled truck driver jobs right now. So this is not, Italy's short up to 20,000 drivers. So again, this is more unique to the occupation, although the labor market is very unusual right now across the world. But my point is, it's more unique to the occupation than to the geographic location of the United States.
Yeah, and you were just recently with Chris Spear and Dan Van Alstyne. You were recently in Europe meeting with your counterparts over there, where you and I discussed this. And again, Romania is a relatively small country. It's tiny compared to the United States. To have 100,000 drivers short, or 85,000 drivers.
71,000 unfilled truck driver jobs in Romania. Yeah.
Proportionately, that would be like having 800,000 short here in this country.
Yeah, you know, one of the interesting, first of all, we had a lot of meetings over there, and every time two subjects came up with the Europeans, right? Environment and labor, truck drivers specifically. One of the interesting things over in Europe right now is Ukrainians were a good chunk of truck drivers in Europe, and of course those folks, males went back to fight in the war, so that's sort of exacerbated their shortage. But they had a shortage before that happened, and in fact, they have changed the rules at the EU level to go down to 18 years old. They were also 21 years old, like the United States. They've gone down to 18 in trying to help with the driver shortage.
So they've sort of enacted what we've done with the Drive Safe Act, in terms of getting younger people on the road and getting freight moved. And I would imagine at this day and age, some of that is military equipment. It's not just wheat and grain and corn and other commodities. It might be military equipment.
Yeah, but they absolutely did that. Now it's up, each country is then passing the same law, but it's in the process. And in fact, Romania just recently did it. So they're down to 18 years old to be our equivalent to an interstate truck driver.
And this is being done, you believe, where it's not compromising safety, because there's been a lot of discussion about this in this country, that as we move in this direction, that we're compromising safety. How do you make the point in saying, no, the Drive Safe Act really doesn't compromise safety? It makes it actually the road safer.
Yeah, I mean, think about all the technologies that's required, the training that's required, much more than what's, if you're 21 or older. So it's not compromising safety. And then the other thing is, Dan, if you went, the average age of a person getting trained to be a truck driver is like 35 years old. Well, we're missing out on those folks when they go to the military. If they don't go to the military and they don't go to college, then they go and do something else. And then they only come to us in their 30s when they're like, I need better pay with better benefits. And we would much rather get them earlier, train them earlier, and again, a lot more training. The other thing that's going to put more pressure on the driver market this year is, speaking of the Drive Safe Act, and you had the infrastructure bill with that, is all the spending that's going to start, which is great for infrastructure, but that's going to require more labor there, which is often labor that competes with truck driver jobs.
Speaking of pay, there was an interesting story that came out recently, just in the last little bit on the day that we're recording this, from Business Insider, and it was very critical of pay rates for drivers in the trucking industry, saying that one of the reasons why the industry is having such a hard time attracting drivers and then holding on to them is that the story said that the level of pay is very, very low comparative on an hourly basis. As someone who crunches the number, what's your thoughts on this?
No, listen, truck drivers deserve all the pay they're getting and more. But the reality is, when you look at the data and you listen to fleets and what they tell you, and drivers, is so many of these drivers, what they really want is more at home time, right? And that's when you hear about fleets raising, pay 8-10%. And I don't know, it varies from fleet to fleet, but 20 to 40% of their drivers are like, I'm gonna drive 8 to 10% less, make the same amount of money, and be home more often. So I think, it's much, I wish it was as simple as it's about pay. It is so much more complicated than that. Here's the other thing though. This is one of the few occupations that has kept up with inflation over the last couple of years. When, average annual earnings for long distance general freight truckload drivers has been going up at 8% plus on an annual basis. That's keeping up, and it's now surpassing what inflation is doing. Not many occupations are in that same boat.
And we hear advertisements on Sirius XM and all sorts of other channels, terrestrial radio as well. Drive for Walmart, starting pay $117,000. Now, to drive for Walmart or one of the other large carriers, you have to be a very exceptional driver and have very good skills and an excellent safety record. But there are many private fleets and other companies that are offering that type of money for their drivers because they know that the churn rate is so high.
Yeah, I mean, churn is something that often comes up, or turnover. And I'm telling you right now, the vast majority of that is jumping from carrier to carrier. Now, turnover rates are lower than they were historically, and certainly at the peak back in 2004, 2005, 2006, in that period. But here's the thing, it's the ultimate, worker empowerment that, I tell people all the time, if you can pass a drug test, if you're a truck driver and you bring me a truck driver in that doesn't have a job, and if he or she can pass a drug test and has a good driving record, I look at my watch and I'll have him a job in the hour, right? I mean, even as freight is slowed down. So listen, if this is, that's great for truck drivers, because it means there's continual upward pressure on their wages. And you can't take away wages. So even if freight slows a bit here, which it is, it's not cratered in the contract market, but even so, there's still a lot of wage pressures for truck drivers, and that's good for them.
Bob, let's talk a little bit in the remaining 10 minutes or so that we have about the supply chain itself. We've heard, the term supply chain now has become so widely known, and it was a topic that no one talked about until the pandemic. Are we out of the woods on this yet, or are we sort of, is this going to be a work in progress as we figure out the balance between trucking and railroads and intermodal, and we get some of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act money in there to fix some of the highways and ports? Is this going to be a challenge that takes maybe to 2030 to fix?
Well, I sort of don't look at it that way. I think the supply chain challenges were just that and maybe it exposed some weaknesses in the system, but in general, it stemmed from just unprecedented growth. I mean, consumer spending on goods in 2021 after inflation went up 12%. Unbelievable growth rate. We've never seen anything like that. And that's what caused a lot of this. But since then, as we move back to buying more services and so forth, some of those supply chains have improved. And in fact, many of them have. Now, are they back to normal? No, a lot of them. I mean, as one case in point, my wife got a new car not that long ago, and she only got one key fob with it because they don't have enough chips yet to give you two key fobs when you get a new car. So there's still those sort of hiccups going on. But certainly overall, things have improved with the supply chain. Again, maybe we're not back to normal, but things are improving. One of the interesting things is, with the ports and all, is the West Coast ports are in much better shape. Now, part of that is retailers just are not importing as much as we as consumers transition back to services. But then also there's been more freight that are going to Gulf Coast and East Coast ports. And so that has also taken some of the pressure off there as well. So a lot of different moving parts with all of this. We're still things we're working on with DOT and the government in general. And I envision that we will continue to do that. But we are in a better place today than we were, say, a year or two ago.
Yeah, such as the Port of Houston, their numbers have been phenomenal. Savannah down in southeast Georgia, off the charts. Same thing with New York, New Jersey, now the number one port in the country, overtaking Los Angeles. Now, if you take Long Beach and Los Angeles together, it's a different story, but they're separate entities. So there's been a big change over the last 8-10 months.
Yeah, those ports that you mentioned on the East Coast, they're all well above 2019 levels still in terms of imports.
Let's talk in our last couple of moments about the infrastructure law. $1.2 trillion from an economic standpoint. As an economist, that's good old-fashioned spending. That's asphalt, that's rebar, that's cranes for ports. That's a good thing when it comes to growing the economy, isn't it?
Yeah, there might be people worried that, we sort of got into the situation we're in large part because I think because of that last stimulus that we did during the pandemic that really sort of pushed us over the edge and got that much higher inflation rates. And so that may worry some people like, oh no, more government spending. Okay, but this is totally different. This is going to pay, dividends for many years to come. Because when spending on infrastructure might be, the best spending that the U.S. government does, right? Because it adds to our productivity for freight, for commuters, and so forth. So I'm excited about that. Now, here's the interesting thing. It's going to if freight continues to be soft here in the first half of the year, once we get to the spring and they really start to ramp up on that spending on infrastructure, that can add a nice little boost to freight that we could probably use at that time. And so it will also, though, keep pressure on the labor market in the trucking industry. So there's some, I don't want to say that those are cons, those are good problems to have. But yeah, I'm excited about this. And I think that it's going to pay dividends for a long time. And it's something that was desperately needed. We talked about earlier how we were in Europe. I mean, there is, those that are listening to this have been to Europe, the difference between a lot of their roads and ours, and they don't even have dedicated funding for it. So we need we desperately need a good a shot in the arm of investment for our infrastructure, and we're gonna get that.
Well, in terms of an economic standpoint, and I'm not an economist, Bob, but the money that came in from Congress, the COVID money, was somewhat of a sugar. It's kind of like, giving a little kid sugar. You get them all running around and all buzzed up and all jazzed up. Whereas with the infrastructure money, you're buying things like cranes and you're repairing bridges and you're putting down railroad tracks and expanding freight yards, which, as you said, makes things more productive, which makes the economy in the long term run smoother.
Absolutely. I think that was a good analogy. And again, some people really did need that money. Not everybody, it was just icing on the cake. But for a lot of folks, it was. But this is different. This will pay dividends. This will add to our productivity. This is great government spending, and I'm excited about it. And it just doesn't happen this year, right? It's over a number of years. So it'll be the gift that keeps on giving, but an important gift and one we need as an economy.
Just have time for a couple of quick questions. One of the things that I've heard about, and this is something that you can, I think, do a good job of explaining to me. One of the things I've heard why the unemployment rate is so low is that our labor participation rate is pretty low. It's in the 60s, I believe, that we have a lot of people who aren't working for either medical disabilities or retirements or whatever the case is. And we also have some people who are younger who have delayed their entry into the job market. How do we improve that? I know you could write a doctoral thesis on that, but give us a short answer of how we can improve that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've looked at this quite a bit. I looked at I said, let me find another country and see where we are to them that is similar to the US. And one of them I looked at was Germany, right? Big industrial economy. And by the way, generally has a lot more supports for unemployment than we do. And you know what? We have about the same labor force participation rate, but the difference is we've dropped about 10 percentage points and they've gained it over the last couple of decades. So now we met in the middle, but I think that's kind of interesting. You know, there's a lot of things that go on here. You know, I talked about 1.7, 1.8 jobs for every unemployed person, but the longer somebody stays unemployed, the less likely they are to come back. And that's a problem, right? So it is something as a society that we need to look at on why this is happening. One of the things I think we can do is why do we have such a negative, sort of thought of blue collar work in this country? Europe, I'll use that as an example again. Blue collar workers are held in very high regard. And I think we need to get to that because those are really good jobs. Any of you that have hired plumbers and electricians lately, you know, they're doing all right. You know, one of the interesting things in the cycle too, Dan, is blue collar workers' pay has been increasing at a faster clip than white collar jobs. That's a good thing and something that has been needed. So there's a lot of moving parts to that. And one of the things we need to do is say, hey, it's okay not to go to college, and it's okay to become a truck driver, an electrician, a plumber, and because those jobs are in high demand. And I think that would help increase the labor force participation rate. But it's going to be much more than that. It's a lot of moving parts.
Bob, overall, you sound pretty optimistic about the state of the economy, a recession notwithstanding, but you sound pretty optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, it's the glass is half full. I do think, you know, we are well into the cycle in trucking. Things have slowed down. But one of the interesting things, we didn't really talk about it, Dan, is what does this industry always do during the really good times? Generally, they go out and buy a bunch of trucks. What could they not do this past cycle? Buy a bunch of trucks. And so I don't think supply got completely out of whack to where demand is, and that's going to pay dividends. So I think, you know, it's still a little bit soft in terms of freight in the first half of this year. The inventory cycle should start to end by then. And by the second half of the year, at least, you know, not falling anymore. And I think we can get a little bit of an improvement.
Bob, always enjoy these conversations. They're high interest. I know our viewers enjoy watching them, and thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Bob Costello joining us. He is the Chief Economist at the American Trucking Association. In closing, we want to thank our sponsor, Spirion, for making this Transport Topics Newsmakers webcast available. We also want to thank Bob Costello for being so generous with his time to answer our questions. This webcast will be available on demand 24/7 at ttnews.com. And in the very near future, we'll have a list of who the upcoming guests are also on our TT Newsmaker series. Again, we thank Bob Costello and Spirion for joining us. I'm Dan Ronan with Transport Topics. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information on future episodes, visit ttnews.com. This has been Transport Topics Newsmakers.